Can you hear me? Oh, hello. Oh, hello. My name is Patricia Hughes, and I'm an Illuminati of University of Warwick. So I'm a mentor and a member of their alumnus. I hold degrees in German and physics, and German and politics. I do beg your pardon. My family history is the name of my talk. When Yeats wrote Easter 1916, he was expressing immense shock at political extremism and violence. And the first stanza of this poem shows that he still identified with the working class. He was still meeting them at the close of day, exchanging polite, meaningless words on the same cultural level, and he was regularly changing his public identity. He was a theatre manager, astrologist, playwright, and poet, so he was used to changing appearance and voice at will and had established alter egos like Michael Roberts by at least 1909. Privately, things were also happening with the approaching death of his father. Suddenly, he became aware that he would have to support his two unmarried sisters, and also that only he could provide an heir. So from then on, his principal aim was marriage for money and a son. In September 1917, he married Bertha Georgie Hyde Lees, only weeks after being presented to her in a register office wedding with no guests. My father, however, was born in the Coombe Maternity Hospital in the Liberties in Dublin on the 9th of November 1920. In 1942, at the age of 21, he enlisted in the British Army. As an Irish volunteer, he had to provide his birth certificate, and so he discovered that he was not Kevin McGill, and Margaret McGill was not his mother. Instead, his name was Kevin Barry O'Neill. His mother, according to the birth certificate, was Lizzie O'Neill, also known later as Honor Bright, renowned as the greatest prostitute Dublin had ever known. She had been murdered when Kevin was 4. His father was not named. Mrs. McGill admitted that she was Kevin's foster mother. There were automatically several ghosts in my family to begin with. Kevin planned to find out about his real mother after his army service, but one thing led to another. He got married, had children, and was weighed down with responsibilities and no money. In 1953, he met a Dubliner who told him that his father had been a famous man. From then on, my father showed me Yeats receiving his Nobel Prize for Literature in 1923 from newspaper cuttings. I did see the resemblance, though I was a child, but with a child's mind, I thought Irish people looked like that. I'd never consciously met any before, apart from my father, who used to avoid meeting Irish people because of his illegitimate birth and his mother's ill repute. In 1961, my father returned to Dublin in order to ask Mrs. McGill about his mother, but she died. He made inquiries at Dublin Castle, and the Garda showed him evidence associated with the court case. Kevin returned home with police photographs of his dead mother and with the bullet that had killed her. He also had a newspaper cutting about the inquest, giving her name as Lily or Lizzie O'Neill or Honor Bright. On his return, he spent 3 days weeping, then showed us what he'd found. He made no further inquiries about his mother in case it injured his wife and daughters, as advised by the Garda. He intended to return to it when we'd grown up, but he died of his 6th heart attack in 1980. Before his death, he told me he'd always intended to write a book about his parents, but I could not find any Lily or Lizzie O'Neill in the Irish Register Office or the IGI. I had no idea when or where she was born, so the project was shelved. In early 2006, I once again came across the picture of Yeats receiving his Nobel Prize. As an adult, it was obvious to me that he and my father had exactly the same features and were closely related. I began to look up Yeats's biographies. Yeats had read his notorious divorce bill speech on the 11th of June 1925, even though 2 days before he'd suffered heart troubles with no medical intervention on the 9th of June when my grandmother was murdered. The 11th would also have been her 25th birthday. And on the 13th of June followed Yeats's 60th birthday. She'd been found lying in a lane wearing expensive but modest clothing that had not been interfered with. There was a bullet hole in her chest. The local superintendent, John Reynolds, had called his sergeant and asked him to take photographs. The following day, the coroner, Dr. Brennan, called fellow lodgers who identified her as Honor Bright, though one knew her as Lizzie O'Neill, born in County Carlow, who'd lived in Dublin for 5 years. Charles Lynch, who married the ladies' lodging house for his mother, said she'd lived there as Honor Bright for the last 3 years. The day after the murder was the first day of the inquest, which Dr. Brennan started at 10 a.m. In mid-afternoon, he suddenly announced that he was adjourning for 2 weeks at the request of the police authorities. Commissioner Ono Duffy, the highest-ranking policeman in the Free State, had arrived, abruptly taken over the case, and brought all public activity to a halt. Nevertheless, Dr. Brennan hoped the next meeting would find the perpetrators of this atrocity brought to justice. I wrote to Garda Síochána and was referred to the police archives in Dublin Castle, who told me she came from Craignaspilla in County Carlow. I put questions on genealogy websites, and one man sent me a 1901 census entry for my grandmother's family, showing she was the youngest of 6 children of a blacksmith. Death certificates showed that he died when she was 3 and her mother had died when she was 8. Elland Island records revealed that most of her brothers and sisters had emigrated to America by 1917. In 1918, aged 18, she moved to Dublin to work, presumably to earn her passage to follow them. On Christmas Day 2006, I had a phone call from the son of Superintendent Reynolds, the first police officer at the scene of my grandmother's murder. He told me of his father's great anger being removed from the case by Commissioner O'Duffy. I wrote next to the National Archives in Ireland and ordered copies of all the witness depositions from the trial of her alleged murderers, but they gave no evidence at all except for Honor Bright's name, age, address, and her location on the night of the murder. No one revealed that Lily had a son or that her son had a foster mother. Mrs. McGill was not called to make a deposition. None of the witnesses were shown the police photographs. No one was asked about Lily's routines, daily life, thoughts, emotions, friends, relatives, or work, or allowed to comment on them. Nevertheless, one of the witness depositions was informative. In it, Coroner Brennan reported on the initial finding of the body, but his name had been crossed out, and Superintendent Reynolds' name had been superimposed. Since the witness depositions had all been made and kept at Dublin Castle, and Brennan and Reynolds were off the case, this had happened without their knowledge or consent. The content of his deposition had been altered. In Brennan's list of the contents of her pockets, a face cream had been crossed out, and a Malthusian sheath, in other words, a condom, had been added. Also, the police photographs had been crossed out as exhibits. Thus, she had been set up as a prostitute by Chief Superintendent Colonel David Nelligan, who'd been put in charge of the case by Commissioner O'Duffy, and also by the man who'd ordered O'Duffy to stop the inquest, who was Kevin O'Higgins, Minister of Justice and Vice President of the Irish Free State. I previously looked up newspaper articles about the murder. At the Pearse Street Library in Dublin, the case had been reported in every single newspaper as the front page headline for weeks. The public had not viewed it as the murder of a backstreet prostitute, but as a major political event. The dates of the trial, 1st to the 4th of February 1926, were outside the official court circuit, beginning 16th of February. It was a kangaroo court. The prosecuting counsel was Mr. W. Carrigan, KC, who had worked closely with Kevin O'Higgins on writing new laws for the Irish Free State. From the opening day, his focus was on denigrating Lily and raising the profile of her killer, Leopold Dillon. The object of the trial was to calm down public reaction in order to prevent the British government from recognising that the Irish Free State was not being run effectively, in which case they might well reassume control. The cover-up was intended to hide all involvement of many members of the government, including O'Higgins, Yeats and his wife, restyling Lily as a prostitute rather than as a senator's mistress, in order to disassociate her and her son from Yeats and acquitting the killer. Excuse me, I'll just take a drink of water. Then I discovered biographies of Yeats's wife George by Brenda Maddox and Anne Saddlemeyer, amongst others, showing that she was alcoholic and secretive. Since she edited all of his works, Yeats knew from the start about his affair, since his poetry is explicit. George also knew everyone that her husband was associated with, including Kevin O'Higgins, with whom she regularly conversed in private throughout 1925. George shared membership of every group or company with her husband, including the Abbey Theatre, where she often took charge of the wardrobe. Only George would know when Yeats was going away from home, so if he was disguised by Abbey Theatre wardrobe, only she would recognise him, and only she could use the same sort of items to disguise herself. So she had every opportunity to find out Lily's address and give it to O'Higgins in 1925. And she also had every opportunity to convince O'Higgins that Catholic Republican Lily was an espionage risk to one of his senators. In fact, Kilmainham House Museum denies that she had any political involvement at all. George also had good motives for doing this: rivalry, jealousy, fear of divorce, fear for her children's future, social ignominy as a rejected wife, fear of loss of social position and loss of money. Apart from opportunity and motives, what evidence is there that she would do such a thing? The answer is in a prayer to my son, which is obviously not about Michael, so it must be about Kevin. It states that Yeats's son was born in Dublin during the Civil War, which he was, and was personally threatened with murder by people whom Yeats knew. However, since no one knew of such threats, they must have come from people with whom he communicated privately, such as his wife and O'Higgins. George edited her husband's works, so she had the opportunity to change dates and names before publication to hide facts as they occurred. After his death in 1939, George hoarded Yeats's works, and with this in mind, one can see what she was hiding. At present, I've been in contact with Leo Varadkar, who in late 2018 passed it to Charlie Flanagan, Minister of Justice, who had asked me to make a formal complaint to the Garda in August 2017, which I'd already done. They made my complaint a case, but do not reply when asked about progress. Since 2017, 6 talks of mine, all welcomed by Irish academic conferences, have been cancelled as the conferences were overcrowded. That was said by Trinity, by UCD, by Cork, amongst others. This means that I am now a ghost. The reality of this granddaughter of Yeats's, along with his illegitimate son, my father, and her mother, my grandmother, are now being denied. But I can guarantee that I am not a ghost. I do exist. But I still need money to take the Irish government to court. So please offer money for my savings account. Thank you very much. And I will be pleased to keep you in touch with what is happening. Okay, I think I've finished my talk now, and I'm ready to hear another talk. Am I right?